Hello, hello. Yeah, hello. We're gonna start soon. We can all take seats. Yeah, yeah. You can sit down already, Pete. It's easier. Herding cats, is that the word? Hello, hello, hello. What? Oh, it's here. July. July. The 23rd, yeah. Yeah, so I'm gonna ask the speakers to sit there. Maybe you can take your seat already. Yeah, please, yeah. And then, so before the conference started, we so they're first going to fight about who has the good chairs and who has the hard chair. So, okay, so before the conference started, we started corresponding and calling the various speakers, and even before that, Patik and I and some others, we were sitting together and we wrote out all the things that we wanted to be covered in this during this conference. Because of course you can say, well, reflections on the self, just do what you like. But we said, okay, we would like to have some kind of structure, some kind of order, bring out some kind of aspects of the self, which we feel would bring about some kind of comprehensive conference. We didn't expect all the speakers to address all the questions, but as long as they address some of those questions, which they all did actually, so that's really helpful. So now we're at a point where we have had 2 days of listening to various aspects, various studies, various approaches, various insights, and I would like with that background now that they start revisiting. We're gonna put the same questions as we put in the paper now here in the conference, and just see in exploring it together where if they come to something new and interesting, or maybe just an exchange and bring out different aspects which we haven't covered so far. Does that sound okay? Good. Good. Then I'll start with the first part. So there's a microphone there, which I hope you can use. You can pass it around. It's like a talking stick. So only one can speak at a time. And as you see, we didn't put out candy or water, so that also helps. Sorry, I forgot about the water. I'll put it later on. So the first question that we addressed was, what is the self? And we had 3 subcategories to that question. The first part was the first category. So what are the different ways in which the term self is commonly used? Dictionary definitions, Krishnamurti's usage in Western and Eastern philosophy, neuroscience, immunology, and psychology. And then the second part on that, how is the term self similar or different from the term sense of self? We commonly understand an individual sense of self as an entity that resides somewhere within the individual and whose core attributes are constant or stable across time. And then the third part, can we come to an understanding and be cognizant of how we are using terms self and sense of self in our presentations and discussions? So I would like to first put a question just to the group, and whoever wants to speak first, or I can also address it first to an individual, but I would like to try just to open up, and if you all could say something about this, the three aspects of this question of what is the self.
Can you hear me? So I was asked to come and talk about Krishnamurti on the self, which I did on Friday morning. But I think based on the context of Yap's question, before I reiterate what I think Krishnamurti has to say about the self, which is that it's not there, I'll talk a little bit about what other Eastern religious traditions have to say about the self, because I didn't really talk about that, and actually that's one of the areas in which I study. So for instance, just as a for instance, in Sankhya and Yoga philosophies, which are a stream of philosophies within the Indian tradition, the self is regarded as some entity, the real self, which is given the name Purusha. And Purusha does absolutely nothing but observes. It's part of a dualism in which you have the observer, Purusha, and Prakriti, which represents nature or materiality. All of Prakriti identification that occurs within the phenomena of Prakriti, which typically constitutes the self. But through the practice of yoga, so because yoga philosophy is tied to this Sankhya philosophy. Sankhya provides the metaphysical system. Yoga has the same metaphysical system, but offers a pathway through which you can come to realize. The task is for you to realize yourself as Purusha, not as some portion of Prakriti's manifestations. And so you learn to quiet the movements of thought, which are the vrittis of chitta. I think Narendra, we had touched briefly on that in the context of my talk. And eventually, when all of these machinations of thinking come to an end, Purusha understands that it is the true seer of everything, the dispassionate observer of reality. It's an interesting system, and you can see some resonances actually with other kinds of teachings, right? So there's this but in this system there is a real self, and that's Purusha, and Prakriti generates a false sense of self, and so on. Now there are other systems like Vedanta, which many people are familiar with, in which the false nature of the self is due to Maya, the principle of illusion, which is one of the aspects of absolute reality, which is called Brahman. The real self that we're seeking the relationship between the real self and this absolute reality. The real self is called Atman. And then what is the relationship between my Atman, my deep innermost self, not the self I sometimes think I am when I'm in daydreaming or what have you, but the real me, the real Atman? What is its relationship to absolute reality of Brahman? And of course I need to do whatever I need to do, which is meditate and this and that, to penetrate through the veils of Maya and discover the real me. If I do that, eventually I will discover, and there are different philosophers who offer different systems. Some involve loving devotion, bhakti, some involve doing things in the world, others involve a kind of a mental approach. So there's these different approaches, but eventually you'll come to discover that the real you, the real Atman, according to this philosophy, the real self, is none other than Brahman, the absolute. Not a part of it. Well, there are philosophies that say you're just a part of it, but these are sub-schools of Vedanta, but the radical non-dual school says there's only Brahman, indivisible. You are it. You are the whole. You are the absolute. You think you're a separate self because of the play of this power of illusion. Yeah, Tattvamasi, you are that thou art. And so And the play of illusion that makes you think you're a separate being and that we're all separate beings and so on is part of what Brahman does. This is the effulgence of Brahman. It plays, it delights in this illusion creating process. But in a way, Brahman ultimately comes to know itself as that. You are that, Tattvamasi. So these are different approaches to the self. I'm not sure that Krishnamurti's position, if I can come back to him, is either of those two. Because I don't think Krishnamurti comes from a position of telling you what the absolute is. He does, if you read or listen to him a lot, he does talk about something at the very end, but it's a very small portion of what he actually does. My sense of him is that his point of departure, where he begins, is always with this, which is what we are at this very moment, what we are experiencing at this very moment. And at this very moment, because why start with an idea of the way things are? Why not begin with what you actually have in front of you at this moment? And perhaps every one of us has something different arising. Something, there's a feeling, there's a thought, there's a sensation, I don't know, a perception, a lack of it, a certain dissatisfaction that I should be more awake at the moment, or what's he saying, I'm bored, I should be somewhere. Whatever is going on at this moment in you, with you, that's the starting point. And in a way, my sense is that Krishnamurti is saying, don't move away from that. If there's anything to discover, this is where discovery is going to take place. Krishnamurti is never really about creating a system. I wrote a book analyzing Krishnamurti and all this, and but he would have probably said, thanks, that's great. How is this going to help you to discover something if you make of that system an idea? And Yap had pointed out, the objective when I read Krishnamurti is not about learning Krishnamurti really inside out. It's about discovering something about this, of which you may be a part, or maybe the whole, or whatever. I don't really know. In other words, there's no conclusion as to what it is that you really are supposed to discover. Discovery is the thing. Discovery is what it's about. And discovery can only happen, in some sense, here at this moment, with awareness. So whether there is a self or whether there isn't a self, the only way one can know this is if one discovers the truth of it in the act of observation, in the act of in the awareness of the moment-to-moment unfolding of something that might reveal a truth. That truth may not be a static truth. It may be a constant process of revelation. Perhaps in Krishnamurti's system, if I can go that far, the question is always open and the answer is always coming. So perhaps I'll stop there and move the microphone to someone.
I think for me the best way for understanding what the self is has been to look at it from a biological perspective, and it just seems to be a emergent process at all levels of biology, so that the biological entity can help distinguish itself from the other without any value judgment about what that means. It's just a function. And you can watch this process get more and more complex as biology gets more and more complex, from unicellular organisms, and Patik talked about how it's even possibly prior to the formation of life. And when you look at it like that, it takes away the kind of mystical agency that we ascribe to the self, or discovering the self. It is a process, and for whatever reason, self-awareness allows us to become aware of some parts of the process, not all of it. Like Thomas would say, a lot of it is transparent. But maybe in that, becoming aware that it is a process and being able to see some aspects of how it functions would potentially help us come to terms with what it is. And maybe it's in that observation of those aspects of the process that are amenable to observation. Maybe there is a possibility for detachment. So that's, for me, that's how I think of it. There's almost no need to ascribe to all this something beyond the biological process. But keeping in mind that the self as perceived by each one of us feels very real to each one of us. So that's always an important caveat. And my sort of meetings with people, say, who are suffering from schizophrenia or any of the conditions, their phenomenal selves were really real to them. You couldn't, you can't tell someone who's suffering from psychosis that, say, you can't give them a story about how this is all made up in your brain. Everything that we're experiencing is made up in our brains. Whether it's tallying with objective reality to some extent or not. So telling someone that doesn't help. So similarly, telling ourselves that, oh, this is all made up in the brain doesn't help. It still needs some amount of work from us. But yeah, for me, that knowledge that it's a biologically emergent process really helps make sense of it.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, for me it was useful to hear all the different ways the terms are used, and many of those were ways that when somebody brought it up, I said, oh yeah, of course, but I hadn't been using it that way or thinking about it that way, so I won't, of course, go into a list of all of that, but so that was useful. It was useful to have that distinction between self and sense of self, because I think many of us agree that we feel the self, so it's fair to say sense of self, without necessarily taking a position on. It's curious how many of the organs that we know exist because it's second-hand knowledge, like each of us has a spleen and a pancreas and a liver and a gallbladder and so on. Most of us don't really have a direct experience of this. You know this only because you're taught, or if you open someone up, you'll find these there. But how many of us have an experience of having a gallbladder as distinct from a certain portion, a lobe of the liver? And they're very real, and they're there, and I hope there's no doubt about that. And then we have this other thing that seems very real, this sense of self. Who doesn't have a sense of existing? And so there's something here that is a clue, perhaps, which is that if something's going on fine and it's doing its job and so on, it doesn't really make a whole bunch of sense to bring it to the forefront and be conscious of it. Why? Things are fine. There doesn't seem to be, there's this value judgment that it's good to be aware of everything, and the more, the better somehow. And why is that so? Why is it better? Why is it any better than being unaware of most things and only having attention drawn to things where there's a problem or a potential problem, and the rest of the time let it be? And I think this is one such instance, and that's a way of looking at it which questions this assumption, if we have it, that A, it's good to be aware, and B, the wider the awareness and the more and the more accurate the representation, so that one day maybe there's this idea that if there's a perfect representation of things, none of these may be tenable, and they're not the fact of the matter. That I don't think anybody would argue. And maybe they don't need to be, is an interesting discussion.
So I will be very brief. I think there's no thing like a self as a metaphysical entity, but there's a certain process, and that process can be described on many levels of description. And I think in the present phase of scientific discovery, the representationalist level of description is still interesting and yields insights. So we could describe the process of selfing as a process in which something is represented or an image is created. And it is interesting, that's the only thing I want to say, to combine this with a second recent scientific insight, that there has been an evolution of self-deception on this planet. Many animals do what they do in a good way because they misrepresent reality. For instance, it can be empirically shown that all parents perceive the faces and their own children as more pretty than other people. You know, and it's not an opinion, it's a very direct perception of sweetness and cuteness, and it's very obvious why that was helpful. And what we call the self may actually be another instance of a misrepresentation of reality that was, as philosophers say, functionally adequate. Right.
Just as you were beginning to put the question, what is the self? I thought if somebody came up to me and said, what is the self? I think I'd probably reply, why are you... if somebody came and asked, what is the self? I think initially, I would probably say, why are you asking? And I just feel that what seemed to have happened is that we're given different ideas about the self and different descriptions of it, from a scientific point of view, perhaps from a religious point of view, from a philosophical point of view. And it brings back to this point about the appearance and the essence. So you could in some sense say that these various descriptions describe the way the self appears from that particular field. So you could say that from the field of philosophy, the self appears as this. From the field of biology, it appears as this. And the idea there is to come a little bit closer to the essence. We somehow have to find a way of combining these appearances into a coherent whole to see what it means, right? And then the next point would be that the meaning of anything is realized in context. You can't work out what something is if you completely take it out of context. So this is why, I guess, to understand what the self is, it's very important that what is the context. If you're really suffering and if you've got some kind of a disease and you're looking at the self, your concern with the self is going to be from that particular context. You're going to say, my self is either dysfunctional or it's not well adjusted, so this is how I'm looking at it now and this is how I'm considering it. If you want yourself to be reaching some kind of an idealistic goal, again, you're going to look at the self differently and see it differently. So I think we need to sort of consider the context in which the self is being discussed, and then we realize that there are all these descriptions. Is it possible to bring them together? And in a way, as my last point, the distinction between the sense and the sense of self, it does throw me somewhat, for two reasons. One of them is that I think there is this strange warring happening, I think, in terms of a dualistic view of the world. So some people would like to put the self onto a non-material realm of existence. It's something special, it's not like matter. Other people say that clearly we can look at it just from a materialistic point of view. It's simply just matter, it's a material movement in that we have that illusion or appearance, but it's only just matter. And of course this can be quite upsetting to people. But the way, and then I'll finish, one way of looking at it would be from the point of view of, again, the meaning of a thing, is that if you think of a book could be argued it's got two types of existence. There's the physical thing and the forms of the letters on the paper, but there's also the content of the book. So perhaps, I'm just putting it sort of in the mix, is that when I was trying to get my head around the sense of self, which for various reasons I struggle with, I kind of thought perhaps I could think of it as another aspect or as another appearance. That's the content, and then there is the physical form. And sometimes I wonder if a more sort of, for example, an endeavor in biology, it is looking at the book, the physical book. And when people are discussing the sense of self, perhaps from psychology, they're discussing the content. But I'm not sort of standing for this, but this is just something that occurred to me about the sense of self part.
Thank you. So we have 5 questions, and we've done one. Well, you all read them already. Well, I thought maybe first the panel to respond, because somehow I feel what the use of that would be is somehow to bring the conference together, and then we can deepen that through questions. I mean that's what I suggest, unless there's I see nobody. I have this consensus bias, and everybody agrees with me now. So question 2 is, what motivates our interest in examining the self and our sense of self? For example, Krishnamurti's interest was motivated by his observation that the self or the sense of self is a fundamental cause of human conflict and suffering. Many philosophical traditions are interested in the role of self concept as the motivator for various human actions and behaviors. Immunologists, on the other hand, might be interested in the distinction between self and non-self in the context of autoimmune disorders and organ transplantation in biology. So, what motivates our interest in examining the self or the sense of self? Or maybe I should rephrase it, what motivates your interest?
Okay, so of course, one function of self-consciousness as it has biologically evolved in us is, as we heard, to make us terribly fascinated with ourselves. And I remember Kay saying that in a certain sense the search for God or liberation is the utter form of the utmost form of, no, the ultimate form of worldliness, and being fascinated with yourself. So it could be that many people that come to that kind of exploring the self are people who have perhaps suffered a lot in their life already, or people who are extremely egocentric, who just want the very best for themselves, and they would not settle for anything less than God or liberation. So that's something I think to be aware of. It's certainly part of the motivation for all of us. But then in this biological context, which will give me a chance to pass on the microphone to you, it is it is very obvious, and maybe I want to say this one point, this is this sunny Sunday morning, we are all rich and healthy people. We're in this federal state of California where there's this hysterical form of optimism. This is like a state religion, but it is evolution is something that has created an ocean of suffering and confusion in a region of the physical universe where there was no such thing before. So evolution is not something to be glorified. And one thing it invented was self-consciousness and suffering to drive organisms forward, but it is no respecter of human suffering. So we are actually in a very difficult situation here, because we are a process that has generated an enormous and unfathomable amount of suffering. And we begin to realize that we've learned yesterday evolution has no goal, no target, no direction, but we seemingly have interests. and that these interests are in no way respected by the overall process that created us. And that's also, I think, part of the historical situation we find ourselves in. What attitude do we take towards that situation? You know, I have no answer, but that's, I think, it's a question.
What was the question again? Interest in this. For a lot of, is this working? Okay. I think for a lot of us, it's probably moments of distress that focus our attention on the self. It could be mild, depending on your own sort of personal makeup. Distress can have different effects on you. But I would imagine that for many of us, it's those moments of emotional discontent that leads you towards asking questions about the cause of that emotional discontent, and ends up at the place where we start asking about the self. And that's not to say that everyone who feels emotional distress will go on that journey, and it's also not to say that people who don't feel emotional distress don't embark on that journey. I think so. You can also say that curiosity plays a role, right? But curiosity, we again glorify it, but finally curiosity also is part of the same process. I mean, if you ask yourself, why does satisfying a curiosity feel satisfactory? I mean, what is satisfaction? It's a certain bodily state of being, right? It's kind of this sort of a little bit of an opposite of emotional distress. So if being curious, if your curiosity never got satisfied, you would have an emotionally distressed state, and satisfying that curiosity leads you towards, now you can come up with evolutionary just so stories about why that evolved and how that has benefited humanity, etc., etc. But on a mechanistic process-driven level, it's again, you can see that it always comes back to the fact that whatever we do is eventually about getting this body to feel a certain way. If it doesn't feel good, it's going to do something to feel good. And the extent of that, how much you pursue that, how much you can endure distress, is really a sign of what kind of personality you are. And that self-awareness can potentially short-circuit that process. And hopefully, when people like Kay, many others will say, stay with the distress. Well, that's what they're saying. Don't act on the distress, just stay with it. And that has ramifications in terms of the neural processes that are responding to that distress. You are short-circuiting them in some way. You're basically not strengthening those very automated, unconscious processes that are making you do certain things. So, I don't know, that was a long-winded answer. So, yeah. Yeah.
You wrote your book. I have the book here. I had it in my bag. And you went at length. I mean, the subtitle is almost like the self and how the self can go wrong, between quotes or something. So, what motivated you to write a book with the self, the nature of the self, so much at the focus?
There are multiple threads to that to my answer for that. I mean, the fascination with the self probably goes back to my growing up in India, and I think by now we all know that if as a civilization, India has been particularly obsessed with the nature of the self, and I've said this to other people who have asked a similar question, that growing up in India, if you're even halfway interested in the self, there are people willing to tell you all sorts of things about what the self is. Obviously everyone can't be right, but they all think they are. So I think there is a kind of a subconscious, if that is your personality trait, which I don't want to take any credit for, because your personality trait is a big, agglomeration of impulses that comes from parents, from neighbors, from your overall culture, and so we're just a mess of things that we don't even understand. And I think I had that somewhere. Plus, you could be reading, I don't know how many of you are familiar with these comic books in India called Amar Chitra Katha. These are mythological tales that are told. And there's always some person wandering off to find himself or herself. And so it's part of the mythology in a sense. So I think that was there. And then sort of intellectual interest took over. And again, like I said, the intellectual interest is not something to be glorified as, oh, this is better than anything else. It was still self-interest, right? It helped me feel a certain way. And that persisted without my really paying attention to it for a good part of my 20s and early 30s. I was a software engineer, and then when I gave up that to become a writer, it was explicitly to start sort of paying attention to the world. And that process then led me to, now that I became a professional writer, I felt, oh, let me tackle the nature of the self, because, again, for a selfish reason, it allowed me, 4 or 5 years of time to delve into something deeply, to incessantly bother Thomas with questions. So, for instance, but when you're trying to think of a book, you're also trying to tell a story. And it took a while to find a way to tell the story of the self. And I was actually talking to a colleague of Thomas, another neuroscientist called Anil Seth. I was interviewing him for an article on the self for the magazine that I write for, New Scientist. And he was trying to explain to me some aspects of the self. And as an example, he took depersonalization disorder, I think. I forget what exact condition he was talking about. And it was at that moment, I clearly remember, during that interview, while I was talking to him, that this sort of flashlight went off, bulb went off, saying, oh, if he can explain to me something using depersonalization disorder, can I not sit down and identify a range of conditions that do similar things for different aspects of the self? So that's how it began. And part intellectual curiosity, part just some desire that goes back to my growing up, which I can't identify with any more clarity.
You gave me that knowing look that you're going to take the mic no matter what. Okay. So I think I'm going to try to suggest that something that might sound a little bit strange. So I have to start by pointing out something that seems a little bit paradoxical to me. So if the argument is that there isn't a self, some people have been suggested, and then you put to that person, well, why are you interested in it? And they give you this whole personal narrative of why they're interested in the self that is apparently not there. It strikes me as somewhat paradoxical. It's a little bit difficult. I find it difficult to get my head around it. And so then I think that perhaps we're trying to make something meaningful, and this is why we're trying to work out what the self is. And I think what we're trying to make meaningful is the wholeness of life. And what I mean by that is that looking at it rather quickly, you would say that there's this self, or there is this sense of self that would be somehow part of life, right? And then to try to make sense of this, you would have to see what is the connection, how does it fit with that? And this is a broader idea of meaning that I tend to talk a lot about, which is that the meaning of something is realized in its context. That's one thing. The second thing is that if you've got parts of a book, but these parts don't come together very well, then you say that that book is not particularly meaningful. So from there you could go to this point where you say that the trying to understand the self is probably trying to make life meaningful or coherent. You could then argue that this fades then into a religious view, that you want to try to make life whole, right? Which then immediately brings me to the opposite of the question of wholeness, which is fragmentation, right? That the world seems to be broken up. And yesterday I mentioned this division that we all seem to take for granted, that there is the world and there is me, the self, right? And so there is that division, and we're trying to make it whole, or we're trying to create some kind of a coherence. So I think all of these things would motivate us to try to make sense of the self, because if we can't make it cohere with everything else that there is around, including other people, then it becomes meaningless. So I think if either we're trying to find meaning, or we're coming from a meaning already, some kind of a coherence. And I'm going to leave them with this very strange, perhaps strange point, that I wonder if the motivation to inquire into the self, again from whatever discipline and whatever point of view, whether that's a personal or individual enterprise, or whether even that inquiry itself, that motivation to look at the self, arises from wholeness. So that it's not that we are individuals and there are no selves. Effectively, I think we're trying to suggest that. Therefore, the motivation to look at the self cannot be a personal or a selfish, something pertaining to a particular self endeavor. So I'm wondering whether something else is going on, that part of the inquiry is something that is actually, and the motivation is something that is not personal. It doesn't come from a person, but that motivation arises from somewhere else. And I'm hoping that might make some sense, and you found that relatively meaningful.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that people have said thus far. I think we attend to things when they kind of stand out in some often unpleasant way. I sort of, when you start paying attention to your health, when there's some sort of unhealthiness. I don't mean necessarily that you actually feel you have a headache or a stomach ache or something. You're, oh my gosh. You might just look in the mirror and for some reason think you're overweight because people have told you this is a inappropriate condition. So that there can be a psychological angst that you now feel that you never felt before, and you decide to do something about it. So dissatisfaction or suffering of some sort, I think, is an important motivator for us in life. And that dissatisfaction maybe does come about from something broader. Because if I see something that causes me discomfort, perhaps a person who is suffering in some way, a beggar on the street in India, someone suffering from a horrible illness, or kind of my day is ruined, right? Because the presence of suffering, wherever it is, affects us strangely. And that leads to a kind of a existential question of, what is this all about? What's going on, right? I want to free myself from this sort of discomfort that I feel, but it hasn't been necessarily self-induced. It is there, present. So the struggle, I think the struggle in a lot of what we do is driven by if not a physical angst, although I talked about physical problems, but a kind of an existential angst for the sense of meaning. Whether we end up exploring scientifically aspects of the natural world this way or that way, a lot of it, it's not necessarily the only thing, because perhaps there is a quest for the meaning of beauty. We often don't, that's equally existentially puzzling, right? Why is there so much beauty in the world, right? But certainly what stands out more so is the stone in your shoe or the thorn in your foot or something, more so than the awesome sunrise or sunset. So, but we're still motivated out of a sense of why. So the why question, quite often I find that in scientific explanations, and I think that's like the classic thing, science always tells you the how, it doesn't tell you the why. But there is a certain element of wanting to know if there is meaning to all of this, the meaning behind our existence. And I think that's, to some extent, and as I say, I feel maybe it comes from the world itself. The world itself causes this question, this puzzling question of why we are here to arise. And that becomes a kind of a driving force towards discovery. Where our actions then take us are multiple. I mean, some people are content with a particular answer which seems to give them solace, whether it's a religious worldview or a political ideology or so on. But for others, there's dissatisfaction. Those answers are insufficient. And the curiosity causes us then to continue this process of inquiry and discovery.
Yeah, Patik, I was wanting to nudge you a little bit, because what is the how do you see the self and even the bodily self? When you were saying yesterday, well, we seem to be thinking that what's unique about everybody here in the room is the genetic profile, but you were also saying, well, 99% of your genetic profile of the cells in your body are not yours, don't have your genetic profile. So what is it? What is a self in that respect, as a bodily self, if you already know that 99% it's not your genetic pattern? So I wonder if you can say something about it.
I don't know what to say, because I certainly haven't found any change in how I feel about myself before and after coming across that piece of information. So that I didn't observe any difference with that. At least for me, for quite some time, there was some sense of either feeling of worth or pride or satisfaction, and I'm one of those who has been interested in these sorts of questions, and then over time it began occurring to me that is this really a matter of pride? I mean, it's kind of like, can I take any credit for it? Like, how can I take credit for the fact that my height is such and such, or some other attribute, my eye color is black or whatever? And then I came across, I haven't studied this too much, but I came across these things that have fascinated me in the last few years about the evolutionary significance of asking these kind of questions. Because I hear, like, there's some comment someone made that such and such is one of the oldest questions known to man, and with that was possibly some implication, at least I heard it, that there's something, first of all, special about man, because you don't hear monkeys asking this question, but you don't hear them asking any question, but that's sort of an aside. And then maybe, and this questioner probably didn't mean to imply this, but is there something special about me that I'm particularly interested in this question? And the whole thing falls flat when you understand that there's an evolutionary basis to the search for truth, the propensity for religion, that first of all has nothing to do with the truth or the search for truth. And what function it serves and how that trait is distributed normally in a population. So there'll always be some who are high on it, some who have zero interest, and most who are sort of somewhere in the middle. And then that takes away the, at least for me, the sense of specialness about it. That it's no different, it's no better or no worse than the search for anything, and it's a rather easy explanation as to why it's there, and that the explanation doesn't in any way involve anything outside. It doesn't involve more sensitivity that I might have had to something subtle that he doesn't have the sensitivity for, and therefore the question doesn't come up in him. Yeah, I'm sort of rambling, so I'll stop there, but yeah.
Yeah, but quick aside to your question about the 99, what he had been referring to. There's sort of evidence sort of accumulating that even we know, for instance, that our microbiome, specifically the gut bacteria, the bacteria in our intestines, they have a remarkable effect on our metabolism and many other things, potentially also in autoimmunity, etc. But what's more striking are the findings that they may even be regulating our moods. So that really leads you to ask, I mean, and they are really not part of your genetic makeup as we define our genetic makeup, right? And once you start thinking of your genetic makeup as having to include the microbiome, the whole notion of what an I means starts changing, especially when you see that your moods are and there is some evidence that even things like, well, bipolar disorder, for instance, some very tentative evidence, so I'm being very cautious here. But mood can get regulated by the bacteria. Who knows what the symbiotic evolutionary process is that's going on here at this point? We don't understand. For me, all of these things are just these are all points of information and facts to question what we mean when we say I exist. So it continues. I don't see any clear answer yet. I don't know when we'll come to any clear answer.
That sort of reminds me, maybe I'll try to say something a little bit quick on that. So it's been known that certain parasites and viruses change the behavior of the host. So there's this classic thing about I forget the name, but it usually lives in rodents, in rats. But for some reason it can't replicate in the body of a rodent. It needs a cat or something. So it easily, and this is really well worked out, changes the functioning of the amygdala in the rodent at certain times so that the rat is no longer afraid of things. As a consequence, it'll easily approach cats when the instinct would be to get away. So more often than not, these rodents that carry these viruses are eaten by cats because they're not afraid, and it's the doing of the virus and its effects in a certain brain region, and then they replicate. So from the virus's point of view, the rodent is a tool to get into a cat when it wants to and can use it. From the cat's point of view, it's like, what's going on? If it had a sense of self, what happened? Or not? Or, why did this stupid cat get eaten and not this smart one? You see, the whole discussion at the cat level,
You mean the rodent level?
no, is a different one from at the rodent level. Because the rodents and there are very serious schools of thought emerging that all earlier forms of life, I won't say simpler, there's a value judgment to that, but earlier is a reasonable term in time. Everything that has come subsequently is in some way a tool. So if the bacteria can't have an idea of something, they help develop something that then has the idea. So then it's a tool. Now that thing likes to think it's autonomous and so on. So I don't know if you're getting the gist of it, but there's very serious work going on in that sort of thing, whereas not only are properties emergent, and networks and so on, but physical phenomena, including species, over time emergent from prior conditions and the actions of those and so on. The stuff you told, there's really good work on that kind of thinking, and it works in many respects. There's another example. There's not so much of it now because antibiotics deal with it, but there was some sexually transmitted disease that obviously to replicate needed the host to have sex because it's transmitted through sex, and I think it's gonorrhea or something, and then it was learned that males with gonorrhea, one of the things that gonorrhea does is it produces alterations in the brain that hugely increases the urge to have sex. So there were these things, why these people, and if they know they're infected, going around having even more sex, and it wasn't them that was doing it, although it was them that was doing it, but it was the gonorrhea to further replicate that's making men who are infected relative to men who are not infected have much higher amounts of sex. and thereby spread it more. Finally, this last notion, this notion is that information can do this by itself, not memory, not the storage of it, not the access of it. And for me, this fascinating concept, and I was trying to tell Steve about that yesterday, is in this Dennett's book, where he says that very similar to this story I'm talking about in terms of viruses and bacteria, and that we and others are their agents, are doing things that they can't directly do. So then you build a tool, and it could be a living tool, just as it could be a non-living tool. And the idea is that language is one of these, and words. And so when sort of the invention of some of that came about, then they compete among themselves. So how does a word compete against another word? It's not even a living thing. It's not even, and it competes simply by being used. So if something's used, not that it is an agent in being used, but those that get used persist and spread, and those that don't die out. And then which words get used more? So let's say you look in the dictionary at 40 words, words that describe ideas that have other functional things get used more, obviously, because they're useful to use. And that's one of the drivers of cultural evolution, including massive changes that have happened in the brain. So it could be that an agent of change is a piece of information, inert information that doesn't even have life, leave alone a sense of, any want, any desire, any drive, any instinct. None of that. You can take all of that out of it. Anyway, I really should stop there.
Patik, now you've again given us this highly stimulating, unsettling, important information. You've given us a lot of this information in your talk yesterday, but it is not sufficiently linked to the teaching so far. Can you perhaps help a bit with that? Yeah, you don't want to help with it, but I'm sure you could. I mean, all this new information, and then the teachings in light of this. I mean, what most directly relates to it from your perspective?
That's worthless. I mean, we spend years talking to our friends, whom we consider friends, whom we feel relaxed with, and if we want to measure the effect of that in these sorts of things, we have little to show for it in ourselves or our friends. What's the point where, no. If someone wants to make something out of it, that's fine, but no talking about it. No, it was to present these things, and then everyone can take out. At least my understanding was not at all to try to create some sort of synthesis, not at all. But because I don't in my routine life even come across the usage of terminology I use in a different way, leave alone, the opportunity to think about it in a different way. That's all.
What aspects of K's teaching are falsified from the perspective of all this new knowledge you've presented, just not tenable anymore today?
What's the point? What's the point of doing that? I don't want to get into that. I really don't. No, it's not open.
Trying to avoid.
Put one question and then I go back. Yeah.
I think there is a fundamental question here which has not been sufficiently addressed. It is true that we are all the product of evolution and biology, and everything that you people have talked about is true. The question is, does that completely determine us? Or we can learn and we can change, especially in the psychological aspects of our being, not so much the physical. if we are completely governed by the neurological processes and the biological processes, then we are not responsible for our actions. There is no such thing as free will. You cannot blame the criminal for what he is doing, because it is the result of his genes, and you can explain why he is the way he is, and there is no other way he could be. And that is completely contrary to what Krishnamurti says. So we need to examine that. Krishnamurti says you are totally responsible for what you do in your life, and so on. And that you can't put it all on biology or forces and so on, because you can learn and you can free yourself of that process. So in other words, evolution gave us, at a certain stage when we evolved from the apes, an enhanced capacity for memory, imagination, thinking, eventually language, and imagination and intelligence of a certain type of thought. It did not determine which way we will use it. It has not dictated which way we should use it. We are just using it with a rather narrow vision, thinking of the immediate pleasure and the immediate gain, and which appears to lead towards survival. But when you watch the state of humanity, it's clear that it's not going that way towards survival. There are even books being written that we will not survive this century. So that's all that is pointing out, that we don't really know what right living is, which means what is the right use of these faculties which we have received in the course of evolution. And if we are using them in the wrong way, we are generating climate change and affecting things, and we are imperiling ourselves, which means it is not leading towards survival the way we are going. If you say nothing can be done, then Mr. Trump is right, and it's all inevitable. Nothing can happen. But it doesn't seem so, because in our own life, through understanding ourselves, we are able to change the way we feel and think towards things. You can free yourself of several things, notions, which you are adhering to by seeing the danger of that, provided you watch sufficiently with awareness and with a sense of enquiry. And it's that learning which I feel that Krishnamurti stressed, of that you can free yourself of all these notions which are creating disorder, both in your consciousness and therefore in society. Now, either that is so, or he was mistaken, and then nothing can be done. Then we just wait for, what do you call it, the ending of the Holocaust. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the freedom part is I put at the end was the fifth question, so that it's going to be addressed. So it's good to put it. No. I'm not. I'm saying it was coming. But I also would love Patik not to get away with his comments, because you gave him an exit there.
Peter's been trying to say
Yeah, and Pete also. Yeah, but I would like to, because I think, like, if you say because there's some kind of implication in what Patik says, like there's a gene, 99% or of our genes are not our own genes, or that there's a virus that in the cat or in the rat, and the cat ate the rat, and all of that. But it seems to be that I think the implication which is not being brought out is that there's something, that similar mechanisms we might be subjected to also, where we think, and I'm trying to give you half the answer or something, where we think we are the agent, or knowing what is driving us, but we might be driven by things completely outside of the realm of our own consciousness, or of our and then maybe are implying that should be taken in consideration while we are looking at these questions. But so now I've given 60% of your answer.
No, I mean, that's it. Yeah. So when you hear something like is it all determined, or is there room for act, like some decision making, that presenting it as a dichotomy itself is a fallacy, because it's not one or the other, absolutely not. It's what characteristic, to what extent is it determined, what characteristic, to what extent is there some openness, what is the domain of openness. So of course all living things learn. Learning simply is getting in experience and then storing that and being able to retrieve that, so that I know yesterday when such and such stimulus happened, such and such was the response. That's the most primitive, simple operationalization of the word learn. So in what domain, what's possible, what's not, it's something that can't be gone through in 5 minutes, and it's absolutely, I would say, categorically incorrect to think of it as either you can learn and do something or you can't. That's absolutely wrong, putting it that way. So the third possibility is that you didn't frame the question right. It's not Krishnamurti was right or biology is right. You may not frame it right. And I don't want to go more into that. There's one other thing that came up that I'm forgetting now. So that's the same sort of question, I think, David, which is we and responsibility, to deal with the words we or I and the concept of responsible. It's not absolute. This is something that even the courts, the criminal justice system is struggling with in certain things. It's not clear. Right now, society has taken the view, so we collectively, through our legislators and through the process we choose to exercise to develop rules, right or wrong, have currently, I don't know if it's of interest to you, have taken a position on this. And the position is that we're not treating, because many defendants in criminal actions say, I have such and such variant of the serotonin gene, which is producing such and such neurotransmitters. I'm producing 4 times more than him. How is it my fault that I get outbursts of anger, and in this outburst I hit someone, and most people wouldn't have? If you don't excuse me for it, at least, judge, would you give a little bit of leniency, is what they're saying. They're saying, that's all I'm asking for. Be a little bit lenient in your sentencing. Don't treat every action of anger based on the damage it did to the person. If you scratch the person, it's not so big a deal. If you broke his or her bones, it's a big deal. And if your violence killed them, it's right. That's what the criminal justice system does. And you have extremely competent attorneys and so on arguing, if not for being forgiven, at least for that to be taken into consideration in sentencing. This is a very, very practical thing going on right now. And the criminal justice system says, no, we take the position without commenting on the science, without making an inference about it, without answering Krishna's question in absolute terms. We're just going to take a value judgment thing. And the value judgment thing is, if it can be demonstrated that this person had no control over his or her actions, and these are the criteria for no, then we put them in like some sort of asylum or something. And if it didn't meet that threshold, which is a very high threshold, no control, we're not going to give any consideration to gradations. Then we're going to go by the action, the consequences of the action. And if someone's killed, this is how we're going to look at it. And if someone's injured, and if it's, the extent of injury. So this is how the criminal justice system is dealing with the word responsibility, without giving an answer. And more importantly, saying there is no absolute answer. because an absolute answer means that the word responsibility is absolute. It's understood that you are or you aren't. But if your question of are you not is not tenable, because the word responsibility is on a continuum, and there are some things for which I could exercise a higher degree of responsibility and some things I couldn't. I really have very little responsibility in the height I became. So if I'm just being absurd, but if that were a criterion, I'd say, goodness, you can't hold me responsible for how tall I turned out to be, for heaven's sake. But if you hold me responsible for how fat I am, I have a lot more responsibility in how fat I am, not how tall I am. And then we can start. Anyway, that's the best we can do, in my opinion, and also that happens to be the legal standard in those things, and that's the basis for that legal standard, not that it's taking a position on for what, who's responsible, how much. But as a society, in the face of uncertainty, in open questions, we still have to make decisions. We need to be consistent with how we treat everyone so that one judge doesn't give more leeway to this. And
I think the problem with what we've heard for the last 50 minutes or so is that, if I have to put it very directly, it based on a paradox, and it based on some fundamental, incoherent, basic assumptions. And to be able to make my point, I have to go back to the point when the rodent is being told by the bacteria, I think, Patik said, of what to do and how to behave. This is very similar to the idea of the selfish gene, that the reason why we do something is that these genes makes us do it. And of course the question becomes, well, what makes the gene do what it does? So what makes the bacteria do what it does to the rodent? So you end up with infinite regress in terms of causality. People don't think about infinite regress in terms of causality a lot, but I think they ought to, because otherwise we run into this extremely paradoxical situation, at the end of which we're trying to explain all sorts of paradoxical things of there's mechanical causation, is just the movement of forces. At the same time, it makes any sense whatsoever to talk about personal responsibility. So I think it becomes a very difficult problem. So since we seem to have moved away from the format of going through the questions and involving other people, I am just wondering, because I feel that you don't agree with me, that perhaps we could maybe just discuss it, that how do you see this question, that when you see that an animal does something because there are bacteria making it do it, and then somebody then puts to you, can you please say what it is that make the bacteria do it? And then you will get an answer. So how do we escape that idea of infinite regress, that we have to go back in terms of causality? And you will be probably familiar with the criticism of, again, we could call it scientific materialism, which says that everything began with the Big Bang. And then people say, well, but why did that happen? And I think somebody said to this that the position seems to be that give us one free miracle and we can explain everything else. You must have come across that. So I think it's important that we sort of tease this out, if anything, for the sake of a conversation.
So with the bacteria, the answer is extremely simple, that it's not infinite. You go back 3, 4, 5 steps to certain conditions, and someone like Anil will articulate those better than I can, because it's in the world of physics. But if you accept that these are the laws, these are the particles at this time, and these are the forces at such and such point in time, some frame of reference, then all that follows can be fairly seamlessly understood with the causation residing in those 3 forces and those 3 particles. So it's absolutely by no means infinite. Let me finish. So I know, I get to that. No. Yeah. I know they're different ones, but No. The physics, there are debates about what came before, but not debates from this point in explaining, and that's in the realm of chemistry and biology, not in physics. I know, and that's... I know, I agree. Fair enough. So if this is a fact, that all of this can be understood, then it's not infinite. That's point number one. Point number two, in terms of the starting conditions, it really gets down to the best I could express it was what I did yesterday. Can something come from nothing, or does there have to be something for something? And if one accepts the notion that something can come from nothing, then that invalidates the question of, well, what produced that nothing, or what came before it, because it's nothing, which is if there has to be a postulate that there had to have been, to use your word, wholeness, you seem fond of the word wholeness, which implies like there's some kind of whatever, like a pre-formationist idea, then you're invoking one more thing to explain it.
Yeah, but
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
anyway, but that's the best
I
we
just
can.
because I can just see it going into a certain direction where it might be interesting for some, and that's a very good lunchtime conversation, I feel, and that should be, and you should take that up. But I feel the central question here, and you can take that up. But the central question was here, which was put: how does that then relate to the teachings? It's very interesting to bring a whole wide range out. So how is it related? So keep that in mind while answering, and please avoid ping pong. That it goes back and forth, because that is just. Yeah.
There's a simple solution. What I've just said, that indeed it comes from quantum physics. If you want to go down to that level, and of course we have to realize that quantum physicists say that the depth of matter goes beyond quantum physics itself. So there will be all sorts of discoveries that will even question the findings of quantum physics now. Even if we stay on that level, and regardless of whichever interpretation of quantum physics you take, Copenhagen or alternatives, of which are many, one thing that none of them disagree on, and I think we ought to take note of that, is the question of non-locality. Simply put, that means that wholeness, which is not a religious idea, but wholeness, which is not a religious idea, I'm finishing my point, comes into the equation, and it comes into any consideration of causality. You have to take into account everything else. Causality and chance in modern physics, essentially the point that Bohm made, that if you follow this logically, you will have to agree that to explain anything, you'll have to explain everything else.
And
I think this is the connection to, if I may finish my sentence, here is a connection to Krishnamurti's teachings, which seems to bring in the idea of wholeness and the totality into the equation when considering issues like responsibility, the self, and so on and so on. And so that's the only point I'm trying to make.
I'm not concerned about that. I'm sure you're seeing the relationship, but it has to be somehow also be able to be followed without people knowing all the very intrinsic specificities of the language that you're using, right?
It's quantum theory is not my language. Non-locality is not my language. So all I'm saying is that the consideration of wholeness, which might have an infinite depth, right, needs to come into any discussion. That's the only point I'm making, and we can maybe go to the next question, because I think we're still on question 3. And
I think, that's good. That's good. No, but what I had, we had one question from the audience which we wanted to ask. Is this a good moment for the question from the audience? Yeah. So, and then I think that we're at time for lunch. So we got from the audience a question. The question was by a woman called Nina Sakun. And that's for Anil and Thomas. Based on your knowledge of scientific research of the brain, is there any clarity on the nature of or function of compassion?
There is research going on compassion, but I personally don't know the details to give you an answer about that. But there's definitely people, neuroscientists, looking at compassion as a trait that, and it's being studied. I think before this session started, Yap and I were just discussing this question briefly. For me, compassion could be the way I would try and approach it in a functional sense would be that I am very automatically compassionate towards people that I am attached to. it's a a pretty automatic response within me. So I would say that if one wants to become more compassionate, then the one thing we should be doing potentially is to be blurring the boundaries of our perceived psychological self. However you choose to do it. For me, one of the things that had struck me about Krishnamurti when I was reading about him, when others would write about him, was this simple act of when he would be standing in line for taking his food, he would wait till everyone else had. I don't know how, whether he did that every time, but that image struck in my mind. Right? That's a very simple act of furthering your, that consideration, because it might be that he was feeling hungry, but he had to, somehow be aware of that hunger and let it, and be with it while others went ahead and took their plates. So simple acts like that will rewire us with awareness, and this is just a small thing, but I can imagine many places in our lives that those things come about, where we just take that moment to push our boundaries a little bit, feel the discomfort for a while, and see what happens. So that would be my way of thinking about extending our boundaries for compassion.
So 3 things. Maybe I cannot report on the details of recent research on the neural correlates of compassion, but I'm quite certain from what I know that in the next 5 to 10 years you can expect a lot of new knowledge. A second thing is that I have noted, interestingly, that in defining the research goal, questions come up that have in the past already been discussed in Buddhist circles, for example. If compassion involves suffering yourself, having compassion with another suffering subject, and there's this theory that the right kind of compassion doesn't involve increasing your own suffering at that psychological location. That may be just a theory, and we should look into this if this is really true, also in the face of new empirical facts. And the last thing I just want to report, when yesterday listening to all your interesting discussions, something that was really striking and salient for me was the idea that compassion could be a form of intelligence. And I thought it could be really interesting not to take this as a romantic metaphor, but in a very literal sense. Maybe it is a form of, informational computational intelligence about which we can learn more. That's all.
It's time for lunch, time for the lunch break. Thank you all.